My app now has a working button that lets me go to the editor activity, but it's an old-style Android button. Newer Android apps have something called a floating action button. You can see these buttons in apps like Contacts. A floating action button appears in the lower right corner, and it has material design animations. You click it, and that takes you to a new activity to create new data. I'd like the same feature, but it turns out that there isn't an easy-to-use floating action button component in the Android SDK, at least at this point. You can build it yourself by defining your own animations, but some developers have created open-source versions of this component, and I'm going to use one of those. I'm going to use the one at this GitHub repository called Android Circle Button. Now, you don't need any of this information up here, like the website URL. Instead, we're going to use a Maven dependency to build in a link to this component in our project. There are instructions for this at the bottom of the screen of the home page. So I'll go back to Android Studio, and now I'm working with a project named Floating Button. I'll go to my Gradle scripts, and I'll need to make changes in both of them. I'll start in the project level Gradle script. The repositories block currently only has a call to JCenter, the standard repository where the built-in components of the Android SDK can be retrieved. I'm going to add two calls here, Maven Central and Maven Local. After making any changes to Gradle files, you should always resync, and you do that by clicking on Sync Now. Wait for a moment until all the work is finished, then you can close this Gradle file. Then open the modules Gradle file, and we'll add a dependency at the bottom of the file. I'll add a new compile declaration and a pair of single quotes. Then type in this identifier, com.github.markushi:/circle button, and then a version number of 1.1. Make sure you type this exactly as you see it here. There's no spell check available for dependency strings. Then once again, sync your Gradle file. Wait for a moment until all the messages at the bottom of your screen have gone away. Then you'll be ready for the next step. I'll go to activitymain.xml. This is the layout file for my main activity. And I'll create an instance of that circle button right here. Because my dependency is now in place, I should get some help in typing in the following code. I'll start with open bracket, then AT, and there I see the circle button component. And I'll select it. I'll set both the layout width and the layout height to 64 dp. That's the standard size of a floating action button as defined in the Material Design Guidelines. Next, I'm going to set two attributes that are a part of the component. They aren't a part of the Android SDK. I'll reformat my code to make it a little bit easier to read. Then I'll create a new XML namespace here with xml_ns:/app, and I'll set it to a value of schemas.android.com/apk/res-auto. Before I go any further, I'll rebuild my project, and that'll make sure that that XML namespace has been read. Next, I'll come back down here to the circle button, and I'll start with app:, and then CB_color. You won't get any typing help with these attributes. You just need to spell them correctly. And then enter the ID of your primary color. That's a custom color that we created earlier in the course. Also set the following attribute, app:/CB_pressed ring width. And set that to a value of 8 dp. Next, we'll borrow a few attributes from the existing button. I'll start at this line, and I'll select align bottom right, align parent end, align parent right, and on click. And I'll copy them to the clipboard, and I'll paste them right here. So this button, just like the original one, will be docked in the lower right corner of the activity, and when the user presses the button, it'll run my custom method. Then I'll comment out the button. I'll select the button code and press Ctrl/ on Windows or Command/ on Mac. Now, to make sure all the code has been read correctly, I'll choose Build and then Make Module App. Now, if at this point you see any errors, for example, if the color or pressed ring width attributes aren't recognized, you might need to rebuild your app one more time. But if you're able to make the module, you should now be able to run the application with the floating action button. I'll take a look at this activity, and I'll see just a little circle, and that's because I'm missing a critical attribute. I want to display an icon in the center of the circle. When we copied our icons into place in an earlier exercise, I included an icon named IC Action Add, and there are 4 versions of it for 4 different pixel densities. I'll go back to the code, and I'll add a source attribute, and I'll set it to drawable, then IC Action Add. I'll look at the layout in Design View again, and there's my plus icon. And now I'm really ready to test. And now I will have switched from the old, ugly Android version of the button to the new pretty Material Design version of the button. And when the user touches the button, I see a little animation. And when they release it, they jump to the editor activity. And they can still click the back button. So that's a floating action button. Again, right now we're using an open source project, and it's entirely possible, or even likely, that Google will introduce a floating action button component into the Android SDK at some future time. But for now, we have open source projects to help us fill the gap.